shut off?
Yes, the furnace is shut off and the telephone is shut off, and this recorder is started, and now I can start thinking about philosophy. All right, are we there? Yes, yes. No, yes, yes, yes. All right, yeah, all right. We're going.
Okay.
Well, we are in the middle, or just past the middle, of a very short sub-series on the principle of action. And that principle is sometimes called the principle of cause and consequence. And sometimes it is called the principle of action and reaction. And some people even call it cause and effect, but that's something that usually has a more scientific definition to it. We are studying this. We're trying to understand the principle as it works in cosmology, spiritual cosmology, which is how things are done in the universe. And we're doing this by asking very fundamental questions, almost impossibly difficult and fundamental questions that are approaching absurdity. And the first question we asked was, how do we know that cause and consequence are connected? We tried to be very rigorous about what we actually know. And we concluded that cause and consequences are connected because we can experience them from a state and being of consciousness that subtends or goes beyond that principle and every other principle. And that state of consciousness from beyond in mysticism is called life spirit. Western mysticism especially. Now, at this time in evolution, we have only little tiny bits of experience in that realm, and we call them intuitions. Nevertheless, the experience of truth, even if it's in very tiny bursts of intuition, has a quality about it. It has a quality of unity, and that unity is felt as self-evidence. It is a truth that knows itself. Now, in the intuitive recognition of truth, the experience of the truth is so strong, and we are so focused in the material world that we think we're seeing cause and consequence. When we see one pool ball come up and strike another one and the other one moves off, we think we have seen cause and consequence. We have seen the phenomenal expression of cause and consequence, and we intuitively know that there is that connection between them, but until we can have full consciousness in that state, we really aren't seeing cause and consequence. So we have an illusion about it. We take what is really an ultimate experience, the ultimate truth of the matter, and we take it for granted that we know the truth. Now, the taking for granted is in the individual, and it is not in the phenomenon. So the problem is not necessarily what we're seeing, but it is in the perceiving being. Eventually, we'll have the kind of consciousness that will be able to see causation from the very beginning all the way to its final end here in the physical world. Until then, we get only bursts of intuition. Now, when we've been discussing this, there's one thing that we haven't mentioned, and that is, how do we know that something is intuition rather than some other kind of inner impulse? This is one of the big problems of spiritual growth. We very often think that we're intuiting something when actually it is the wiles of the desire nature in us that makes it feel like truth. It's a very good imitator. It's a very good forger. So that's an extremely important part of the spiritual life, and I'd say one of the most important things is to know when we are in touch with the spirit in intuition and when not. And that's why we do spiritual exercises. That's why we get to know ourselves, because when we know ourselves, we can discern where things are coming from. But that's a whole nother subject that we don't want to go into. So the last time we met, we asked a second question, and that is, when does a cause become a consequence? And in that we concluded in a very simple way that a cause becomes a consequence when there is change. This tentative answer to the question opened up all sorts of other side issues and other questions, and last time we only talked about a few of them. We'll try to do a few more this time before going into the question for this evening, but even at that we won't get very far, and that'll leave all sorts of other things. Something to ponder. Take us away from other things in life like politics and not fruitful things. Now, one of the things that this question brings up, or this answer to the question brings up, is what actually changes. The question and its answer implies something changes. And that implies that there is a state of being that changes or that is capable of change. In fact, there might be several different kinds of changes. And that implies something relative compared to something eternal. Because change relative to all time, which is what eternity is rather evanescent. It's just a fleeting, or it's a temporal kind of thing. But that kind of talk about change is talking about the change and not what has changed, which is what our question is. This implies that there is something, a state of being, that actually changes or is capable of changing. In this, it is implied that that which is changed by a cause is relatively passive or relatively receptive to change. And it's relatively receptive to the agency of change. Now, if you note in the last few sentences, the word relatively has been used quite a bit. That is important for all spiritual aspirants. We need to learn what is relative and what is not relative. That is, what is more or less relative or relevant, either one. See, in spiritual things, especially when we get those hits of intuition that we know are true, there's a tendency to think of things in absolutes. That's especially true in our time, because in our time we live in a digital world. A switch is either on or it's off. And there's nothing, it's not relatively on, it's not relatively off. But reality is much more analog. It's more one way or it's more another way. Now this problem of relativity versus absolute is something that very great spiritual minds have fallen prey to. For example, Lao Tzu, the great mystical philosopher from China, said something to the effect that when you make a good man, you have automatically made a bad man. Now that is an absolute statement. It's a polarized statement. In the first place, the opposite of good is not bad. The opposite of good is not good. Now, in terms of relative thinking, you could say, if you have a good man, you could have someone who is relatively not good. And by the same token, you can say, if you have a good man, you have the possibility of someone who is relatively better. In that way, you have an evolutionary kind of consciousness. And it isn't, like you're not done. It's something that is ongoing all the time. And that's really important. Otherwise, we fall into some, in our time, right now we're dealing with polarization, very great polarization, where people are clashing with each other in an absolute sense. And the good thing about relative thinking is that it is open-ended. There is no limit to how good one can become. If we go to the Orphic philosophers like Plato or Plotinus or somebody like that, they call the divine spirit the good. And this means that we can evolve to a better and better state all the time. Anyway, back on topic. We said just a few seconds ago that which changes is passive or relatively passive. Now, saying that does not mean that there is no resistance. In the physical world, there is more resistance, and it isn't always completely passive. In fact, a stiff resistance is easier to accommodate than real passivity. Somebody who is dead and is in the state of rigor mortis is easier to carry around than somebody who's flopping around and is soft and miscible. Liquid water has resistance, and that resistance is harder to deal with than if you have ice. Now, I find this kind of thing exceedingly engaging. And I find it difficult beyond my capacity to know things. For instance, this view leads to the notion that a cause is more spiritual and the stuff of consequence is more material. Now we're in a place where we have all kinds of paradoxical opposites, and we're going to have to deal with them all night. If that were true, then all creation would be vertical rather than horizontal. If changes in pool balls came from something above the pool table, that's vertical causation. It is from outside, just like the very basic life spirit that is beyond all principle of cause and consequence is beyond it. It's vertically above it. Now, the skill and control of a pool shark would have no difficulty accepting that. But if we try to go accept that throughout all being, it becomes much more difficult. On the pool ball, after the cue ball has, which is the causal agency, strikes another ball, it is its own path of causality is changed. However, as we are looking at it now, causation doesn't begin with the cue ball. It's an agency, but the causality actually begins with the pool shark. There are questions in this we can ask. Is the pool shark also changed by this? The answer probably is yes, but it's probably only a tiny bit more. And it doesn't lead us to where we want to get with this fundamental question. In asking the question, when does a cause become a consequence? We're asking a question about time. And ironically, if you look at what we have said in the last few minutes, we are seeing it in terms of space and not in terms of time. In fact, if our observations are correct, we have described the basic dualism which underlies everything. In philosophy, academic philosophy, that is called the mind-body problem. In spiritual philosophy, it is called the principle of life and form, or the principle of spirit and matter. Now, instead of looking so much at form, let's try to answer the question of when does a cause become a consequence in terms of time. Again, we're going to be very, very simple, and it's going to lead us to simplistic kinds of thinking. So there's a danger in that. We have said that a cause becomes a consequence when there is a change. Obviously, in this, we can see that the changes occur in the present. One moment, something is not changed, and the next moment, it is changed. Now, this agrees with what mystics call all time, or what mystics call eternity. Because in eternity, there's so much time that it is the present all of the time. It's always now. It's always present. Now, seeing things this way might bring consternation to some people who want to see the Spirit, the divine, God, as unchanging. But if we look at things this way, it is preposterous that everything in the whole cosmos is changing and that the Spirit behind it all is not changing. This is not fake. This is for real. And so if the change is real, the change is real for the universal Spirit. Now, it's true that when we experience things in the Spirit, we experience them differently. And in the phenomenal worlds, things change readily. But it's not so different that this truth doesn't hold true. After all, the Spirit is the source of reason. Now, Spirit is always live and enlivening. In fact, that's the very definition of spirit. If you look in the dictionary, spirit is seen as the ultimate animating force. Now, those who hold the kinds of views that the spirit is unchanging are usually the ones that say that the phenomenal worlds, where we think and where we emote and where we physically experience things, is illusion. If it's illusion, is this all a big fake? I can't handle that. Now, to me, I'm rather petty, and this kind of view is something like the docents up at the state capitol when they see the marble and they see in the marble there are fossils, and they say those things may have been there millions of years ago, or they may have been placed there by God. And the people who think the latter way think that the fossils were put in the stones by God to see if we could be tempted by Satan into believing in things like evolution. So yeah, this is literally the case of what's going on. All right, I'm probably lost in my notes by now. Standing so far away from my notes is difficult. Again, looking at things comparatively helps us to understand this as other thing, as well as other things. If we think in absolutes, we don't understand them as well. There's so much time in transcendent spirit that it seems changeless, only to our consciousness, because our consciousness is very evanescent. Things happen, whip, 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 they're happening here. Even if we have an experience like reading a good book, like a historical fiction book, you can become so enwrapped in it that it seems timeless, and you have no idea of what's going on around outside of you. But that's only in the world of thought. You think about compared to our consciousness here, where we have to make split-second decisions on the highway versus being immersed in a book versus having an experience in the universal spirit. They're all quite different things. If we look at these three states, the past, the present, and the future, we come to some rather curious notions, and some curious notions that are paradoxically opposite of what we have concluded earlier. The first is, that's clear, that the present is when a cause becomes a consequence. It is now when things are changed. If we step out of a boat, the boat doesn't go back later on, it goes back at the same time we're stepping forward. It's instantaneous, it's constant. So that's what the present is like. Following this line of thinking, it is the future that is changed. It is the future that becomes the past. It is being brought to life and objectified as the past. Clearly, then, the way we're looking at things, the future is the realm of potential for change. It's very potential. So it's so potential that it is subjective. It could be different ways, and it all depends on our action. So we have that principle of action all over again. Now, in some way, or in the same way of thinking this way, the past is clearly the realm of consequence. The possibilities of the future become actualities in the present. They are changed, and they are changed into the certainties of the past. They become the consequences. We see this every day in retrospection. It is clear that we can see what we have done, and we can, by looking back, we can see what has led to things being as they are not. As they are now, I'm sorry. It is not so clear that we can discern what we have not done. But it can be done. If we look at history, we can look and see that if this had been done, things would have been very different. Within the consequences, even inaction or the unwillingness to act are indicated in the outcome of consequences. We do that all the time when we say, if I hadn't said this or I hadn't said that, things would have been a lot different. You can't take the history back. It's changed. Now, when we combine this kind of thinking with what has been said a few minutes ago, things really become peculiar. A few minutes ago, we said that spirit is more like cause because it is the activating force. And the principle, it is what is behind the principle of action. And we also said that matter is more like consequence because something becomes a consequence when something is changed, and that matter represents the potential stuff of change becoming actually changed. Now, if we combine these two views, we see what appears to be an outright contradiction. And to some people, to combine these two views is outright ludicrous. However, if we examine this carefully, we can understand something about the nature of spirit and about the nature of cause and consequence that is objective. We find it in the biblical Christ, who says things like, before praying, he said, I know my prayers are already answered. And if we look at history, we see the power of the past is a very powerful causal agency. Everything from our legal code to the scientific method and all of spiritual tradition is of the past, and it has a tremendous influence. Precedents have an extreme, it's a different kind of action than I'm going to move this pool ball forward. It is a causal agency that seems passive, and that's why you have to understand what you're thinking about when you're looking at these questions in this way, that when we say that the past is more like the spirit, and the spirit, you may say, has been fed by all of the experiences and the soul extracted from them that becomes objectified consciousness in spiritual being, it's easy to see it that way. That makes sense. But seeing spirit as the animating force behind everything makes the spirit seem more like the future, but that's really not quite the way it works. The spirit seems to work more indirectly than directly, but there we're in a field. I don't want to go that far afield in this. So what we're saying basically is that the dead, to a large extent, rule the living, because the acts of the dead have an influence on everything that we do. But that action is a different kind of action than striking a pool ball with a pool cue. Now, please beware in all of this that this is only one side of the spirit. The spirit is multifaceted and it has many sides to it, which is to a simple material mind who wants it to be one thing and that one thing produces. That's not the way it is with the spirit. By doing little sojourns like this, we can come to understanding some of the consciousness of spirit and how it functions in the creation. But it is not going to be simple, and it isn't going to be the all in all. It isn't going to tell you everything. The only way you'll get that is if you are alive in the spirit. You have that kind of enlightened state that you can see it all. Now, if we look at the other side of this, in this way of thinking, the future is in matter. And many spiritually minded people who are aware of the dangers of materialism, to them this is offensive. In our current state of materialism, we tend to see evolution as caused by interactions of matter and not by interactions in matter, by a higher causal agency. This gives us a skewed view of matter. Also, with our blindness of the spiritual worlds, we don't see other kinds or states of matter. We don't see the spiritual world. We don't see the desire world, which is a different kind of matter. And because of that, we have illusions even about matter, to say nothing of the illusions that we have about spirit. For example, we can say that art is a means of making beauty in the spirit manifest in matter. So if a sculptor is living in the spiritual imagination and he sees a block of stone or a hunk of wood or a pile of clay or something like that, he sees a statue in it. And he brings it out of the potential of that matter. It is brought about by the creative agency of the spirit, but that statue was already in principle in the matter. And the art is the matter of bringing the spirit out through the material form. I don't know how to say it. So matter, in this way, we can see as a congealment out of something unknown, that is through the potential of space, that is through matter. Now, all of this seems very fine and dandy, but if we look at our living reality, something doesn't jibe, even with these little partial or fragmentary views of spiritual reality. So let's look at one little disconnect and determine if it is real or if it is illusory. The thing that doesn't seem to square with our experience is that the future and the matter through which the future is made manifest isn't merely resistant, and it isn't passive, or it isn't rigid. It often seems active. Sometimes things seem to come charging out of the future at us, charging into the present. So it's not a matter of just chiseling a statue out of stone one little bit at a time. Some things come out of the future, whether we beckoned them or not. They're here, they're in our face. I've experienced this a lot in astrology. looking at our current context of looking at past, present, and future, this kind of approach seems to be erroneous. But by now you've probably, if you've been keeping this in mind, you've probably realized that we have made the same mistake that we accused materialistic scientists of making in a previous talk. We have taken causality and we have tried to break it down to one simple cause, one simple effect, just exactly as the scientists try to do in a laboratory. And we saw clearly that that is simplistic. It's true what you come up with, but it's simplistic, and it's simplistic because it is incomplete. It doesn't tell the whole truth. So it is trying to make one cause and one consequence. Now that may be possible with the first cause. That is the ultimate cause that brings everything into creation, but that's a singularity. That's, that's the only one like that. We're down here in the mess of things. Things get pretty messy after that first cause. And they get messy because there are multiple causal agencies. The foci of spirit, the gods, so to speak, are multitude. And they're all injecting things causally into the stream of things. We see this even in humans. We're causal agencies, and we see right now in our society there's a tremendous clash between people on all kinds of things that we thought that we were beyond. We see a lot of clashes over racism. We see a lot of clashes over religious freedom. So it's not surprising that we would see causes coming at us rather than we just projecting our own cause and into the future. So the future comes at us through others who are in the causal activity. In this, our causation within our own being is not simple. It's in fact multiple. I'm sure we all have had that experience that we think we would like to do something, but in our desires and in our emotions we do something else. And we are not, Christ asks us to be single, to be whole, to have one eye. And we aren't that way. We have not brought everything in our own being to work together in unity. So we find all kinds of mixed motivations in ourselves. And Shakespeare probably says it best when he says, "What wretched errors hath mine heart committed, whilst it thought itself so blessed never." We think we're doing something good, and the consequence is not what we expect, because we have other motivations that slide in because we're not in complete control of our consciousness. We've all experienced wanting one thing and getting another. And we haven't even got to the question yet for tonight. Now, there are also different grades of destiny. From pure potential, where anything could be, right down to the nitty-grit of all the little things that are in our lives. For example, time and space, on a grand level, are conditioned by the beings associated with the planets and the other astrological forces. They are agencies. They're conditioned. They don't cause things the same way we cause a pool ball to go. Though again, that's one of those illusions. The people think that the stars are making us do this or making us do that, rather than the stars setting up a condition, and that's their kind of causation. And our causation is making it be one way or another down to the last detail. And we think that we blame it on the stars rather than our execution in what the stars have been made available to us by conditioning things coming into being. If you look at an ephemeris, an ephemeris is a gigantic book of potentiality. All of these things could be, and we could see that time is flavored, that there are eras and periods when things are one way or another. The thing we've just been talking about, the polarity over racism, is clearly shown in the stars. So there are things also that we do, that we are causal, when we work together collectively. Because when we work together collectively, we have an influence that we don't have when we act singularly. It's like the little threads in a rope. You could take all of those threads and put them in parallel with each other, and they wouldn't be especially strong. But if you twist them and wind them together, each of those threads contributes to a very great strength. And the same thing happens when a lot of people are working together. But when they start working together, the consciousness is more in the collective, and the individual oftentimes loses individual control to the collective control. So we can see that there are that this is not simple. Anybody who tells you that they understand cause and consequence and why something is happening to somebody, they're just passing judgment, and what they're indicating is their own personal limitations. A lot of people, like industrialists, come up with the idea to make something to improve the condition of mankind, and it does. But at the same time, there is the unintended consequence of making something else obsolete and putting a lot of people out of work and things like that. So it's not a simple way. Cause and consequence is not just single. We have responsibilities when we act collectively, and who and how and when we associate with other people, and we have responsibilities when we act individually. I can't say it enough times. Cause and consequence is not simple. And if we try to make it that way, we're just not seeing reality as it is. All right. The way I approach it at this point in life is when I have decisions to make, I try to make them by intuition. And I try to go with a simple impulse. Because I find that if I get into deliberating these things like we're deliberating in these talks, it becomes very painful, and I never make decisions. I never would have married unless I were forced into it. It wasn't like a shotgun marriage or anything like that, but I could never make up my mind to do it. And this is probably why I like Hamlet so much, even though I would prefer to be Prospero. Because Hamlet is, thinking, oh, what about this? And what about that? All right. Finally, we have a little bit of time to work on our third fundamental question about cause and consequence. We have looked a little bit about how we know cause and consequence are connected, and we've looked a little bit more at when a cause becomes a consequence. Now we're going to do a little bit on a collateral question, and that is, where does a cause become a consequence? And this is another one of those things that brings out another of the universal principles that we started these talks with. And that principle is everything is in everything. If you look into any matter, if you go deeply enough into it or purely enough into it, you know something about anything and everything. Because the universal spirit is in everything, it gives itself to everything. We could say this another way, that everything partakes of the universal spirit, and you can't take that universality away from it. Now this principle is a corollary to, or is another related clearly to the principle of analogy. In the principle of analogy, as above, so below, what has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. That's the way that the Spirit maintains unity on all the different levels of consciousness. We understand by getting in touch with an analogy, we get to see a bigger picture from above, and we can see things more clearly, sort of like the pool shark overlooking the pool balls at the table. Everything and everything is more of a focus on the connectivity of everything. The idea that there is no isolation of anything, not even in the lower part of an analogy. Now, if we apply this to our situation, we see we cannot understand when a cause becomes a consequence without understanding a little bit about where a cause becomes a consequence. So everything we've been saying earlier in this evening about when also brings us to where. When we say where, we're talking about the co-principles or the potentials of time and space. And time and space are inseparable. And again, time and space is something is more timely or something is more spatial. It's again relatives. It's very important that we look at these things in terms of relative. We concluded twice now for 2 meetings that a cause becomes a consequence when there is a change. You could just simply say it is where that change takes place in terms of observation that a cause becomes a consequence, but you don't learn anything that way. If a change is gradual and very widespread, it's exceedingly hard to discern where a cause becomes a consequence. It seems almost ubiquitous, and the cause seems almost ubiquitous. Very often it is. With spatial things, cause and consequence brings out a different kind of difficulty. And to get at this difficulty, we have to clarify something which has been looked at many times but never completely elucidated. We have to differentiate between horizontal and vertical causation. We've mentioned it several times without actually saying what it really is. We do this by looking at a diagram that we've used many, many times in these talks. It is the diagram of the creative tree or the spirit matter pole. We see this is the center of being, which is in the center of the world of thought, and everything above that or beyond that is abstract. Everything below that, outward into these worlds, is concrete. So we have a concrete mind or concrete thought stuff. We have desire world, we have the physical world, which is etheric and chemical. It has a subdivision there. And then we have life spirit, and then finally divine spirit. And at that center of being, we have the difference between spirit and matter. All right, that's something we've looked at a lot of time. Now, when we look at this, the different worlds are made to look like planes. And it is because of diagrams like this and because of vectoral kind of thinking that a lot of people don't talk about them as worlds or states of being. They talk about them as planes of existence. I really don't like that, but I can see how it comes about with this kind of a diagram. All right. In this conception, when there is a causal interaction on any particular plane, that is a horizontal causation. When one pool ball is striking another, that's horizontal, and it's taking place where energy is being brought into the chemical and it plays out in the chemical horizontally. When something from a higher source enters a lower level and produces change, that is vertical causality. Now, in the first talk, we saw that horizontal causation would be fated, that it would be deterministic. Like when you set the pool balls rolling, somebody breaks the rack, the balls start going all over and bumping against each other, and that could be determined. If you were clever enough, you could measure how much energy there was and what the angle of striking was and how much spin there was on the ball, and you could see exactly where everything would end up. And that is the way a lot of earlier philosophies saw cause and consequence. They saw it like you've got to do things this way, you've got to experience things that way, and it was like determined. There was no freedom in it at all. Also, we concluded in the first talk that life spirit, that all the principles, including the principle of cause and consequence, have their beginning or have their function in the region of abstract or ideational thought. Beyond that is pure truth. Beyond that is pure life. Beyond that is pure creation. And the causal things are brought into the spiritual worlds from life spirit. Now, boy, I just don't like this down low, but I hate being a slave to a camera. All right. In understanding this, it becomes clear that something new can always be injected from any level above any other level. And things, without that, the horizontal creativity, if the pool player didn't bring in new strokes, everything would wind down. The balls, by friction, would eat up all of the energy and momentum, and everything would come to a stop. So, without the vertical causation, there would be nothing new. So, this is actually right within the principle of analogy. When it says, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. And that is about as true as you can find things to be. Now, determining when a cause becomes a consequence is simpler because change is apparent. determining where a cause becomes a consequence is not so simple. As far as I can tell, there are two types of answers to where a cause becomes a consequence. One is in a specific location in space. That is in one world, or right on the pool table. Where it is something that is very specific. But there are millions of places or loci in space and many millions of causal agencies, so there are many places that a cause becomes a consequence when it is a horizontal. It's very specific. Now, to understand the general cause, we have to look at the diagram. Going upward is more spirit, going downward is more material. Going upward is more life, going downward is more form. That's pretty clear. At going up toward the top, once you get to life spirit, it's like time is so much that it's eternity. As things become more abstract and rare going upward, the further down you go in the material half of the spirit matter pole, the more things become material and the more matter becomes condensed, though condensed is not the right word, but there is no right word in our language. Maybe there is in Sanskrit, but I don't know of any in our language. Now, there are other differentiations between abstract and concrete and between life and form. And some of them relate to dimensionality in space, which is what we're trying to get at when we say where. The way it turns out is the further up you go, the more inward things are, the more within. The desire world, if you think of it in terms of three-dimensional space, is very broad compared to the physical body of the Earth. It's very big. It extends as far as Mars and Venus if you're looking at it in a three-dimensional way. But it is, the important thing about it is that it is within the physical world. And the tendency to be without goes down the spirit matter pole, so that when you get to the earth, that's why this is closed off here. When you get to the physical world, the chemical subdivision of the physical world, you have only the without. There is no within to it. You break open an egg and you see a new without. It's not the same thing as when you have the inner vision and you see the within of something. That's in the desire world. You see a little bit of it in the ethers already. So what we're saying, that the further you go up the spirit matter pole, the more within things are, until you get to the point of life spirit, that the life spirit has only within, and that what would be a without in anything else is within in the life spirit. So what we're trying to say is, in the general causation, where a cause becomes a consequence is without. In without, there is objectification. And from that objectification, the creative agency in spirit becomes objective in its consciousness. So there's a big difference between objectivity and objectification. Obviously, this is all very forced because we're out of time. And there are many, many more facets to all of this, but you understand that a cause becomes a consequence when it has been objectified to the intent and capacity of the causal agency in a vertical sense. That is how that is where something becomes consequential. That's as far as I want to go. So we have two answers, a specific and a general. A specific change of cause to consequence happens where the focus is in space. The general place where a cause becomes a consequence is when a causal impulse has gone as far without as possible, when it has become objectified as far as possible. You could put this together with what we said earlier, an event rather than just a trend that comes up and then goes back, but an event is an objectification where there is a definite and final change, and that definite and final change has a much greater reaction on the consciousness of the spirit in viewing it in like in a historical sense, and the objectivity is taken into the spirit. So there's loads, I don't want to leave because there's so much material in here. Now, we're going to have one more talk about cause and consequence, but it's going to be completely different. It's not going to be asking these rudimentary types of questions, because you can only do so much of this. It's not healthy to do more of this, and it's better to do a little bit at a time and then come back a few months or a few years later and do more of it. It's just psychologically, it's not healthy. It feels, it's like going to the movies. If you go to a movie once in a while, you get wowed and all sorts of things are popping in your head like popcorn. You say, oh, that's what that means. You have your own stream of consciousness going on. But if you go to the movies every day, it loses its savor. And it's the same thing with spiritual things. You can come back to them every day, but you can't do it on this level, at least not at this time in evolution, and have a healthy spiritual growth. So next time, which will this time be 2 weeks, not 3, we will have one more talk on cause and consequence, and then we'll get back to the life cycle. And please think about what we've talked about tonight, because this is one of these sets of notes that is very painful to make, because there are so many things that could be said and so many insights. I didn't give any insights at all into life and things that you experience every day, but it's up to you if you want it. That's it. Thank you very much. Yes?
I believe I heard you say about 5 minutes ago that life spirit puts things into the spirit world, and I think you meant to say the physical world.
Oh, did I say that? Okay, I'm sorry if I said that. Yeah, life spirit is the unconditioned creative spiritual consciousness, and it injects things into the causal worlds. Yeah, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. Any questions on this? Okay, thank you very much.